Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Infirmary, where my guests and I try to help you guys approach endurance sports from a happier, healthier, and faster point of view, helping you avoid injury and burnout and remain focused on the things that we love in endurance sports. And I could not be more nervous and floored to have Joe Friel on the show today. Joe Friel literally wrote the book on triathlon and cycling and mountain biking training, the Triathlete's Training Bible. I was telling Joe before we got on, was the book that I carried around in my 1993 Saab in the early aughts as I was trying to learn how to do this sport. And he's a lifelong athlete who holds a master's degree in exercise science, and he has trained and conferred with amateur and professional endurance athletes from a huge variety of sports since 1980. And based on those experiences, he founded TrainingPeaks.com in 1999 with his son Dirk and his friend Gear Fisher. He was the coach to our last guest, Olympian and Ironman champion Ryan Bolton, and he currently coaches only a few athletes, primarily focusing on training emerging top-level coaches to prepare endurance athletes for competition. That passion for education takes him to coaching seminars, corporations, and national sport governing bodies around the world. As I said, his Training Bible books are ubiquitous on shelves of amateur athletes through master coaches worldwide. Joe Friel, welcome to the Infirmary.
Well, thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to chatting with you and hearing what's going on right now in your world also.
Awesome. Yeah, I as I said, I couldn't be more chuffed to have you here. But my first question, so, we've already alluded to this, like you have been in hundreds and maybe even thousands of these interviews where people ask these questions that they've come up with ahead of time. But what are you interested in right now? What is a topic that you wish somebody would ask you about?
Oh, gosh, there's so much going on right now in the world of sports science. The one I think that interests me the most right now was one of the newer topics. It's probably only been around for, I don't know, 5 or 6 years. The concept of durability in training, preparing for long events where you have to hang on at the end. An Ironman's a perfect example of that, trying to hang on to whatever it may be, a 9-hour race, a 10-hour race, a 12-hour race, 14-hour race. Trying to still keep going when it's late in the race is a critical area right now, which we're just starting to really talk about. We've always known this is an issue, but sports science has finally gotten interested in it just in the last handful of years. And so we're starting to make some progress in that area right now too, which interests me because I always enjoy seeing what's going on in the world of sports science. It's new. So much of it is a remix of what we've done for, in some cases, decades. But this is one of those new ones. So I'm really paying attention to what's going on there and learning all I can about it.
Yeah, I mean, there's always this interesting thing in the world of sport where coaches are sort of more tinkerers and tend to hit on concepts usually ahead of the research scientists. But then the researchers, like usually confirm what it is the coaches have been doing for a long time. And yeah, I've noticed the same thing that in the last 5 years of, you see durability and fatigue resistance and even one hilarious term, fatigability, which I was like, what? But it is a concept that, even if like the sports science hasn't articulated it, like it's something that you've been wrestling with your entire career when you're coaching long distance athletes. So how did you think about durability before there's this term that we now call durability?
Yeah, this goes back to the very early 2000s, like 2001, 2002, 2003. Back in about that time, I required all the athletes I was coaching, which was a large number of athletes at the time. I probably had 24 athletes I was coaching. For the first time ever, I required everybody to have not only a heart rate monitor, which everybody already had at that point, but also a power meter and a speed and distance device for running. And so I started paying close attention to what the data I was getting back from athletes, what I saw on their TrainingPeaks accounts when I was analyzing the post-workout sort of thing. And one thing that stood out for me was how there was a separation going on between heart rate and power on a bike or heart rate and pace on a run. And this happened someplace late in the workout or race. two lines would be parallel for a while. The heart rate line and, say, the power line would be parallel for a while. But at some point down the line, they would begin to separate. Now, that wasn't a brand new thing to think about. It's called heart rate. I had terms for that myself. I called it decoupling because the two were going apart. But the idea had been around for some time that this is what happens, called cardiac drift. The heart rate rises. But sometimes this is confusing because if I had the athlete doing a workout where they had to hold a constant heart rate, what would happen is power would drop off. So it wouldn't be heart rate, in the actual term, heart rate is not rising at all. What's happening is heart rate staying the same, but power is dropping or pace is slowing down. So I began toying with this idea and came up with an idea called decoupling, which we built into TrainingPeaks back in the early 2000s. I don't think anybody knows how to use it. I find very few people understand it, but it's a good tool. It really is a
It
good
is a good tool. I know how to use it. I think of you every time I use it.
You're one of the few, I think, who actually uses it. Most people look at it and just shake, just scratch their head and don't really understand what's going on. It was something, it grew out of another idea I had back at about the very same time, which is called efficiency factor, EF, on TrainingPeaks. And all that does is it compares power or pace with heart rate. And it just tells you how efficiently you were operating, how many watts per heart rate beat were you doing, for example, on a bike ride. And then I began to think later on, well, that's just showing me what's going on now, but I want to know what's going on in terms that, and what I have to do is take that number, by the way, once I get this number, power divided by heart rate, and compare it with previous workouts, which are very similar. And so that's a good way of seeing what's happening to your aerobic endurance over time, which for me, people like me, is really interesting information. But I began to think, well, what about during the workout? What is happening with this EF idea, this efficiency factor idea, during the workout or race, as opposed to with the previous workout or race? So I came up with a formula, which was fairly simple. I won't go through all the details of that. It just bores people. But basically, I came up with a formula that told me what was happening during the course of the event, workout or race, to the person's heart rate relative to their power or pace. And that number you come up with is a pretty good indicator of what we now call durability or stamina or resistance, resilience. There's all kinds of names for this. So this number actually kind of tells you what that was all about. But at the time, I didn't really think about it in terms of having a name for it. It was just what I did to decide if the athlete was how long they could maintain that pace or that power output before heart rate would begin to separate. So that's how it all came about, and it really didn't catch on until about 2000, 18, 19, 20, or right around there is when the first research came out on durability, and they're basically explaining what I was working on back in the early 2000s. And if I gave it a name, which is interesting because I didn't give it a name at all. I just thought it was an interesting concept, and so I followed it. But anyway, that's available on TrainingPeaks and has been there for more than 20 years. So it's a new idea, but it's been there for a long time, quite honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I use the decoupling ratio and efficiency factor all the time, and you're right. It is something that I have to explain to my athletes. But the thing is once they get it, they get it. And and then if you work with somebody long enough, then they're like, well, this number's supposed to be under 5%, right? And I'm like, well, yes, and this has to be. We have to compare it to like something similar. Like we can't. This isn't just something that we do all the time because workouts are different. And if you have an interval workout, it's going to be a little different than a steady state workout and things like that. But so in the early aughts, you're sort of using this new kind of tool that, 20 years later is going to get called durability. How would you train athletes to have, you didn't have a term for it, but to display less aerobic decoupling?
Right. Good idea. Yeah, that's the key. That's what it's all about. Just having a number is good enough, but knowing what to do with this number is the important thing. And so the way I would train the athlete is the starting place for this, quite honestly, is what most athletes, I wouldn't say avoid, but they tend to give very little value to, which is endurance training, aerobic endurance training. That's the starting point for durability. If you really want the athlete to be durable late in the race, what they must have, number one, is endurance. They must be able to go for a long time. Long is a vague term, which depends on the athlete we're talking about and what the event is we're talking about. A sprint distance race is far different than an Ironman distance race in terms of this concept. Um, uh, so what I'm going to want to do is to establish great aerobic endurance of the athlete. Most endurance athletes seem to me, are resistant to endurance training. They don't want to do it because they think it's a waste of their time, because it involves a lot of zone 1 and zone 2 training, especially zone 2. And we'll come back to this a little bit later on, probably, because I've got some things that we can talk about in that regard also. Um, the idea is you've got to have endurance before you can have durability. So you've got to get to the point where a long workout does not at race pace or race power, just a long workout, long, easy workout becomes second nature to the athlete. That's got to become the first step in improving durability. Once we have that, then we can start doing some workouts. That's really the base period of training. We're going to build endurance during the base period. When we get to the build period, which is now in the last, let's say, 8 to 12 weeks before the event we're training for, this is the specific training preparation period. During that time, what we're going to do is start dividing the workout into 2 phases. I should back up one step here. There's one more thing that actually is going on here.
Love it.
We need to be aware of, and that is we're eventually going to get to the point where we're doing workouts which mimic the race or portions of the race. We're not going to mimic the entire race, but portions of the race. And that's going to require getting there gradually over time. So we've got to go take this in steps, one step at a time. We're going to start off with endurance. That's a key point in this whole thing. Then we're going to add intensity later on. And then finally, we're going to add density, which is race intensity. We're going to bring all the things, bring endurance and intensity together into one workout, and that's density. So when I've got the athlete working on duration, that's just building in the base period aerobic endurance. Then we go on to working on the intensity of training. Now I'm going to divide the workout into 2 segments. And by the way, we're only going to do this once or twice a week. This is not the sort of thing you go out and you do every day. Once or twice a week, we're going to do this workout. And it can be a very fatiguing workout. It takes a lot out of the athlete to do this. So you can't really wind up doing too many of these in a week. 2 I found is about right. 1 is better for many athletes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that workout. Let's say it's going to be a bike workout. I'm going to have the athletes build their durability on the bike. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have them do a long workout. And that long depends on the event we're talking about. That could be an hour and a half. It could be 4 hours. It really depends on what we're talking about as far as the athlete and the event we're training for. The first portion of the workout is just going to be a warm-up. That's going to be a long warm-up, very long warm-up. So the athlete, let's say we're doing a 2-hour durability workout. The first hour is going to be warm-up. It's going to be like zone 2. I could define that as being time, like an hour, or I could say I want you to burn 2,000 calories. That's your warm-up. Usually athletes have to figure out how to know what their calories are. It's on your Garmin, for example.
Totally. Yep.
So you can find the data and you can pay attention to it while you're riding. So there's various ways of doing this. So I can give it time, or I can give it calories. I can give it work, which kilojoules, which is the same thing basically as calories when you're riding your bike. So I'm going to say that this is the warm-up. It depends on who the athlete is. It's going to be relatively long. Then we're going to go into phase 2 of the workout. There are 3 phases. We're going to go into phase 2, and this is the phase where we're going to work on durability. So now the athlete will do something on the bike, such as we're going to do long intervals. So we're going to do 20-minute intervals with 5-minute recoveries. And we're going to hold a steady pace, steady state, steady power throughout each of these intervals. It could be 3 of them, it could be 5 of them. It depends on the athlete, what they're training for. There's all kinds of variables here. What we want to do is we want to go just to the edge of the athlete's current physical fitness and push them just a little bit. So I don't want to start off with having them do 20 of these. I may start off with just having them do 2 of
Jeez.
them.
Yeah.
And then we're going to get that right before we move on to the next phase, which may be in a week away before we do it again. But what I want to see happen is I want to see the second phase of these 20-minute intervals, for example, or it could be a steady state ride for an hour. It's going to be something that's going to take the athlete up to race intensity, and then we're going to hold it for a while. And then we're going to recover perhaps and make this into intervals. So the idea is we're going to push the athletes decoupling. We're back to that idea again. This is where I'm going to pay attention to what their statics is after the work is over, what the data is I'm pulling from their TrainingPeaks account. So that becomes phase 2. Now, the key here is pacing. This is where athletes usually screw up. Let's say they're going to do 3 20-minute work intervals with 5-minute recoveries, and it's going to be done at 200 watts, plus or minus 5% sort of thing. So that's the range we're trying to stay in. The way most athletes wind up doing this is they do the very first interval. Instead of doing it at 200 watts, they try to do it at 240 watts. And then everything goes south from that point on. They start fading. By the time we get to the third one, what's happened is we've got this thing we've been talking about, this decoupling begins to take over and becomes obvious that they're decoupling gigantically because they was one out too hard. So it's a learning experience for the athlete. Besides doing the workout to build fitness, we're also building their mental fitness, which is how do you pace a workout? I've had athletes do that, and it really kind of angers me because I told them not to, what to do in the workout, and
Yeah.
they don't do it. They go ahead and they do this thing, which is based entirely on emotion. It's not based on what they should be doing to build fitness. And so when that happens, what I've done for some athletes, I know just don't learn very quickly, is I say to them, okay, this wasn't right. We're going to do the workout again in 2 days. We're going to come back and do the very same
Oh.
workout again in 2 days and do it again. And this time I want you to do exactly the way I told you. And if they come back the next time they still did it wrong, we do it again. And 2 days later, we do it again. And I do this until they get it, till they understand what it is they're supposed to do on the first interval. Because if they don't learn this now, what happens is when they get in the race, they do exactly the same, they make exactly the same mistake, and they fade. They don't have any durability at the end because they went out way too fast. I had one athlete one time, I had a very difficult time getting him to understand this concept. He was training for an Ironman, his first Ironman. He was a very good athlete, but he'd never done Ironman distance before. He had done shorter distance and was an excellent athlete, and I thought had great potential. And so I had to drive this home stream to him over and over and over. And so when it came to the night before the race, as I do with all the athletes I've coached, I talked to him on the telephone and we talk about the race. What's going to happen? And I'm already telling him, I know what's going to happen is you're going to want to go out too fast. And I'm telling you right now, you can't do that because here's what's going to happen. If you do that, you're going to pass a lot of people and feel really good about yourself. And then late in the race, they're going to be passing you. So here's what's going to happen is when the race is over, I'm going to talk to you. And the first question I'm going to ask you is, how did you pace the first 5 miles of the bike portion of the race? How did you pace it? Because that's the key. That's the key to your success. If you do it right, you're going to have a very good race. You do this poorly, you're going to have a terrible race. It's just not going to work out for you. So I've got to make this over and over and over thing with the athlete to make sure they understand. And then I've got to threaten them that I'm going to talk to you about this and hold you accountable for what you did in the race after the race is over. Immediately after the race, I want to talk to you about this because I want to make sure you did it right. And so I've had this athlete, the first time he did this Ironman, he turned out to be later on a very good Ironman. He said when somebody would pass him early in the race, he had this feeling that he had to go harder because somebody was passing him. He said, Joe told me not to do that. And he's going to talk to me after the race is over about doing this, not to do it. So he said, I held back. I held back every time. And people kept passing me. And he said, you know what? I passed all those people later in the race, either late in the bike or on the run. I passed all those people because they were making the mistake I used to make. So he learned his lesson and he went on to be a very good Ironman triathlete. But it was a little bit of a challenge to get him to that point. So anyway, that's how important this is. that you've got to get it right in training.
What do you think changed for that athlete? What do you think finally got through for him? Like what after doing it successfully, did he change in the way that he enjoyed training and racing?
He learned a lesson, and it was a very, very important lesson. The lesson he learned was he had to train in a way that involved holding back early in the race when you feel really good, because that's the mistake that that poorly planned athletes make when they do an event like this. I don't care what the event is. It could be a sprint distance race. You can see the very same problem as an Ironman distance race. It just is on a different. We're just talking about different numbers. Is all we're talking about. It's the same problem. Yeah, every athlete makes this mistake. So the reason I'm talking about this is the reason we're doing this workout is to learn, number one, how to pace yourself in an event like this. So you've got to learn to hold back on the first interval and to do as the plan calls for. As I used an example a while ago, I'm looking for 200 watts plus or minus 5%, or whatever the numbers may be. But that's what I'm looking for on every interval you do in this workout session. Going out at 20% higher than what I called for in the first interval is something you probably want to do, but don't do it. And so you've got to learn to do this over time. It takes constant reminding yourself that I cannot do this because it's going to mean failure in the race. I'm not going to have a good race if I do this. But most athletes don't think that way. They think in terms of how they feel in the moment. They don't plan ahead for what's going to happen to them. So long story short, the basic idea is we're trying to get the athlete ready for the race. So we're not only building physical fitness, we're building mental fitness. So there's two things happening here. So that's phase two. And over time, this phase two will become longer. We'll fit in more of these. Let's say it was 20-minute intervals. We'll fit in more of these into the athlete's protocol for that day before we cool down. And the idea is by the time we get to the last one of these workouts prior to the race, which will be a few weeks before the race, they'll be able to do a very big segment, something they could not have done early in this build pretty training. So that's phase one, warm up. Phase two is the durability phase. And then phase three is the cool down. So the athlete now cools down after this, having done this. And that's the workout. It's a grueling workout. It really is a grueling workout, but there's a lot going on here. This is going to be very valuable for the athlete mentally and physically.
When you're looking at analyzing a session like that, I would imagine that the thing you're looking for is, let's go with the 3x20 example with 5 minutes of recovery. If I were running that exercise, that workout for an athlete, I would be looking in that final interval to see where the decoupling begins to set in. And then be like, if it, say that the athlete begins to display decoupling at, 15 minutes into the third 20-minute interval, I'm like, this workout was perfect. This was exactly what we needed. Is that the same kind of approach that you would do in terms of analyzing to figure out how much of this training distribution that I need?
That's exactly what I would do. If there are 3 intervals, for example, I want to examine each interval to make sure that the athlete is not decoupling. And then I want to find out where they do decouple. If they don't decouple at all over 3 20-minute intervals, they don't decouple at all, fantastic. They can handle a lot more now. We can go to 4 next time, no problem at all. If they decouple during the second interval, we've got a problem. We need to really be perhaps we need to make instead of 20-minute intervals, we need to make them 12-minute or 15-minute intervals and see how the athlete manages that. And if they still decouple, so we're trying to find where it is that we get this balance, this decoupling not occurring until the last part of the workout. It's okay to decouple, but I want to see it happen late, not early. If it happens early, we've made a big mistake. So that's the whole idea. We're using this decoupling idea to see how we're doing as far as preparing this athlete for competition.
It seemed like earlier you wanted to say something about zones. The term zone 2 popped up and you were like, oh, I want to talk more about that later. And obviously zone 2 is really having like a moment in endurance sports. What about zone 2 kind of made you be like, oh, I want to talk about that?
Actually, I'm doing a self-experiment right now to know more about the answer to that question. The bottom line is, without talking about that yet, is that athletes are reluctant to train in zones 1 and 2 unless it's driven home to them. Most athletes, maybe this is changing. I don't know, but maybe this is changing. I hope so. But most athletes tend to see zone 1 and zone 2 as a waste of their time. They want to get on to the stuff that hurts. That usually means zone 3 is a starting point. They want to be able to hold zone 3 for a long time. And that really doesn't accomplish much for them at all. There's a lot of things that go on in zones 1 and 2 that athletes, for the most part, are not aware of. There's physiological changes that take place in zone 1 in zone 2, that don't take place in zones 3, 4, or 5. And so if you only do zones 3, 4, and 5 all the time, you're missing out on a lot of the stuff that has to do with physiological fitness that you won't get any other way. So it's not a waste of your time, which is what most athletes tell me. They feel like they're just wasting their time in zones 1 and 2. They can do that already. The thing I hear the most common is, I'm already good at going slow. I need to get good at going fast. Well, that's fine. I understand. But you're not really good at going slow until you've done slow a hell of a lot of times. And most athletes give up on it before they actually get the benefits. So should you spend more time in zone 1 or more time in zone 2? This is one of the things that's one of the big arguments going on right now. Do you get as much out of zone 1 as you get out of zone 2? I've not been able to find any research on that. I've searched. I'm trying to a personal experiment here. I'm now on day 9 of 3 weeks of training, riding my bike only in zone 1 and measuring efficiency factor, EF, after every ride to see what happens to it. So after I get all this block of zone 1 workouts done, then I'm going to do a block of zone 2 workouts, the very same number of workouts, same courses, so forth, all exactly the same, as much as I can make them, and see what happens to EF then. So I'll be interested to see what happens with all this, but I really don't know. Inigo San Milan is the guy who's really kind of behind this whole idea of zone 2. And I know Inigo quite well. He went to Colorado State University in Fort Collins, Colorado. And I owned a running store in Fort Collins, Colorado, and a bike store. And he used to come into my store, and he rode with my son. They were training partners back in the 1980s. And so I got to know Milan very, very well. Nice guy. Mm-hmm. Really enjoy talking to him. And he's done some great stuff in coaching. He coached, Pagaccia and some of the best athletes in road cycling. He's been the coach of. So he knows his stuff. And he really gives a lot of credit to zone 2 being the reason why Pagaccia and other athletes he's coached have done as well as they've done. And I believe him. I don't disregard what he has to say at all. I believe what he's saying is true. I just want to see it for myself. I just want to know from a personal point of view what this means. So I'm playing around with it right now. When I get it all done, then I'll post it someplace, probably on Substack. I'll write something about what I found. But for right now, I'm just having a good time doing a little post workout research study of what I'm finding out.
Yeah, that sounds great. I would really enjoy a training block of just zone 1 riding. That would be awesome. I feel like when you've been a coach for a while, you flip to the other direction than athletes do. You're like, oh my God, easy training. This sounds amazing.
It is. It's kind of fun.
What how do you define the break between zone 1 and zone 2? A lot of the time we in exercise phys world, we sort of have the three big zones, moderate, severe, heavy, and severe, usually connected metabolically to LT1 and LT2. But these days, there's some sort of zone 2 kind of tops out a little bit above LT1, but so how are you physiologically making a distinguishing between your zone 1 and your zone 2?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm talking about a 5-zone system here as opposed to 3-zone, which is what you described a second ago. 5-zone system puts your lactate 1, threshold 1, at the top of zone 2. So this is all lactate level 1 and below is what I'm talking about. So and that's zones 1 and 2. I'm kind of old fashioned this good way. I really use the field test to determine my threshold, and I play around with things that I can use on the bike, for example, or running, to kind of confirm that. For example, one thing that's getting a lot of popularity right now, which I don't see anything on at all, is respiratory rate. during workouts. How much air are you moving in and out, and how rapidly do you move that air in and out of your lungs? And that's one of the new areas I think we're going to be seeing a lot more of in the coming years, is measuring zones, for example, using respiration. In fact, there's research showing it works. And we've been talking about this for a long time, that you can use, we tell people, if you can carry on a conversation, you're in either zone 1 or zone 2. You can't carry on a conversation. If you can't get out, 5 words, you're probably in zone 3, maybe higher than that. And so I played around with this over the last few months. And what I came up with is a very simple system for determining LT1, which is lactate threshold 1, which is the top of my zone 2. And it's a simple little thing. It involves respiration while you're riding or running. Can you count to 1,006 without taking a breath?
Amazing.
So, for example,
out loud. Speaking out loud. Yeah.
Out loud. For example, like this: 1,001, 1,002, 1,003, 1,004, 1,005, 1,006. If you can do that, you're probably below LT1. You're probably in zone 1 or 2. If you can't do that, you're above zone 2. You're probably in zone 3 or maybe 4. If you can't count at all, if you can only get out 1,001 is all you can do, you're probably in zone 5. So it's a simple little way of testing this thing without having to draw blood every time you go for a workout to see where I am right now in terms of lactate. That's quite accurate. But it's also, quite honestly, most people don't want to really have their blood drawn to find out what they're doing as far as zones. Most people are resistant to that. They would rather not have their fingers poked, their ears poked. And we're going to get away from that eventually. I keep expecting this to happen really almost any month, is for somebody to come out with a continuous lactate monitor, so that you'll just slap it onto your arm and it'll give data to your wristwatch, your Garmin, or wherever you have it, or your Whoop, or your phone. And you'll be able to see exactly how much lactate you've got going on right now. We've not gotten to that point. I don't know what the holdup is, but been talking about this for a few years, and I haven't seen it come out yet. But we'll have that eventually. But in the meantime, you can use ventilation as a way of doing this, and just kind of reinforce what you think is probably your zone, the upper part of your zone 2. LT1. And that's how I do it. I'm just trying to stay below. But when I do this zone 1 thing, I break up the zones. Basically, it's about 10 beats lower than LT1 using heart rate. And that's my LT1. And so my next phase, this will be this self-study I'm doing, is to use zone 2, which would be the 10 beats up to LT would be the zone I'm trying to stay in.
Nice. That makes it, Kolie Moore at Empirical Cycling has been, he and his coaches have also been trying to figure this out. Like, what is the minimum intensity? Like, can you do 30% of FTP and still have it be doing something? Like, what is that thing? And I mean, so far he's kind of discovered, like, there isn't a floor so far. Like, pretty much any movement helps if you're trying to build endurance, and like, obviously you need to progress it. You can't just keep doing the same endurance over and over. That's not going to work. But I mean, it's so helpful for those of us as coaches to be like, yeah, you just go ride your bike, go for a run. That's the important thing, rather than, are my endurance rides 1 watt below the top of Z2? Is that where I'm averaging? Which is something that I think a lot of triathletes will do, something very obsessive like that, when you're like, you don't need to do that level of fidelity.
Yeah, I think for most athletes, if we just stay in zones 1 and 2, if we're trying to make an easy workout, that keeps you below lactate threshold 1. That's really, really all we can ask. We don't really need to, I've been doing this for many years. I've kind of gotten used to talking about at least 5 zones. Sometimes I talk about 7 zones, but we really don't need to be quite that precise about it. 3 is adequate. So if we're talking about this below LT1 as being zone 1, that's fine with me. Just stay in that zone all the way through an easy workout, and you're going to do great. No matter if you're 10 beats below LT1, your threshold point, or you're 2 beats below it. That's not that critical. Just making sure it's easy is the primary thing here.
I'm so glad that you clarified that it was 1001, 1002, 1003. I was like, whoa, counting up to 1006. That's a lot of numbers. It was like my next bike ride. I was going to be out there. You're like, Joe told me to count to 1006,
Yeah.
998, 999. Yes. So everybody listening, please, you're only counting 1001, 1002. We chatted beforehand. Buddy Matt Lieto had said hello, and also told me to ask you about Skimo, and that Skimo is something that you are super into at the moment. And I was wondering what place that is playing in your life and in your training.
Skimo, for the listeners that may not know, is ski mountaineering. And it's really not me, it's my son. He is really big into ski mountaineering and has done quite well. Um, which involves basically, really, if you go to a ski area, what you do is you take your cross country skis with you and you strap them to your back and you run to the top of the first mountain. And then you put your skis on, you ski down to the bottom of that mountain, another mountain, and then you put your skis back on your backpack again and you run up the next mountain and so forth. And that goes on for hours. It's a grueling race, which he enjoys a lot.
If you were coaching him from the perspective of endurance sports, like what would you do in terms for an athlete that's trying to do well at Skimo? It's an event that requires the entire spectrum of endurance intensities. How would you train somebody for an event like that?
Yeah, the one they do is used in the Olympics is not exactly the same thing that we see most athletes doing, at least in Colorado. I'm not sure what they do around the other ski areas in the country, but in Colorado, they're multi-hour events that are done on very, very difficult terrain, mostly downhill ski areas. And it's really, it is grueling workout, a grueling race. And it involves a lot of endurance training. That's the starting point. You just got to have tremendous endurance. And then we go back to the whole idea of durability. It's the very same thing all over again. We're talking about the same stuff, being able to get yourself to the top of the next mountain with the skis on your back instead of on your feet, trying to just run up the mountain as fast as well as you can. So it involves exactly the same sort of thing we're talking about. You've got to, the challenge is you've got to go to some place where you've got terrain that will be appropriate for training. It's obviously not flat terrain or even rolling terrain. It's mountainous terrain is what it is. And so the training is really difficult, and probably the best way to train for it is just to go do Skimo races. That gets you in that situation, and there's quite a few of them around Colorado anymore. I'm not sure about the rest of the country, but you can do a lot of Skimoing around here anyway.
Yeah. So you've been in endurance sports basically your entire life. What has kept you here?
Fun. I enjoy it. When I was a kid, I enjoyed doing I went out for all sports that were available. If there was a sport, I went out for it. And so I learned very early to enjoy sports because it just became a part of my life. I tried to, the only thing I found out I was really no good at was basketball. And then I grew up in a basketball state, Indiana, which is, that's the primary sport in the state of Indiana is basketball. Unfortunately, it changed this year to football when IU won the national championship. That was pretty unusual. They usually win basketball national championships, never football. But back in my day, it was basketball, and I got cut off the basketball team in the seventh grade. We had three guys that went on to play in the NBA on my team. That's how impressive my school was. It was a small school. We only had I don't know, 500 students in the school, something like that. Or fewer than that, actually, probably like 300. And here were three of them go on to play in the NBA. And so I didn't make the team. They cut me. And so there wasn't any other sports at that time. And so I took up just being in shape. So I started running all the time. When they were practicing basketball in the middle of the winter when snow was coming down, I would be running bleacher laps around the gym, up and down the bleachers and around the floor and so forth, just getting in an hour or so of training. And I really enjoyed doing it. Everybody thought I was crazy for doing it. Nobody else in those days would do that sort of thing, but I saw it as being kind of fun. And so I ran track, and then finally my junior year, they came out with wrestling. And so I went out for wrestling instead of running intervals in the gym, and became a wrestler besides. And so I was participating in lots of sports, went on to college, continued to run track team, and continued to play football, and continued to train year round. And it's quite honestly, it's just been a part of me. I never saw it as being anything unusual or strange. It was, for me, just fun to do. stuff I enjoyed. And so it just kind of stayed in my life, and I've been doing it as long as I can remember.
And what do you think? I mean, we're going through such a period right now in endurance sports, both in terms of the speed is getting faster. Also, athletes are not just focusing on one kind of endurance sport anymore. What do you feel like are kind of the challenges and also the opportunities in endurance sports right now?
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on. We could talk about, for example, race day nutrition, taking in carbohydrates in a long race, and what's going on in that field right now. That's another amazing topic, which we don't know all the answers to yet, but we're learning. We're seeing the elite athletes are taking in twice as many carbohydrates as we used to say was the limit. All you could possibly manage. Now they're taking in twice that amount. So where's the limit on this? Is there something we're missing right now that could allow you to take in even more carbohydrates? We learned what to do to double it. Could we triple it? What could we do? Is there something out there we're missing that may change the whole field? So it's just amazing stuff that's going on, and you got to kind of like stay on top of everything that's happening. But I don't think you want to try everything. I don't think everybody should all of a sudden start taking up 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour just because the pros are doing it. That's not something that happens overnight, and you need to know what you're doing before you get involved in doing something along that line. But we're learning lots of stuff right now that could be beneficial to people at all levels in the sport about nutrition. For example, there's other stuff too.
Yeah, how about I mean artificial intelligence is a big one. What do you see, what role do you see that playing in the endurance world for better and for worse? Because I think it's a complicated topic.
It is. It's one thing that has coaches somewhat concerned because, as you can tell, obviously you could ask AI to create a training plan for you using the methodology of whoever you want to pick. Chris, for example, use Chris's methodology and come up with a training plan for me for the next 4 weeks, and it could do it. It would come up with a training plan and spit it out for you, and you could start following that training plan. And so coaches are a bit concerned, and with good reason. But I would suggest that there's a lot you don't get out of AI to create a training plan for you. A coach goes beyond just creating training plans. A coach is really more somebody who understands you and what goes on between your ears and what you can tolerate and what you can't tolerate. The best way to help you become a better athlete. I talked about using threats with an athlete, a little while ago. Maybe that wouldn't be appropriate for all athletes. I read about an athlete recently who is a star basketball player, women's star basketball player at the collegiate level, and she's got a pact with her coach that she wants the coach to unleash on her whenever she's not playing well, to let her know in no uncertain terms that she needs to change how she's playing right now. And you can't do that with all athletes, and AI certainly is not going to do that for you. They're not going to chastise you for how you train or pat you on the back when you need that, or help you out with something that's going on in your lifestyle. Coaches don't just write training plans. So I'm trying to convince coaches you can use AI to your advantage, but I wouldn't be worried about it. So, if an athlete wants to play around with doing that, more power to them. Let them try. But it just leads to more problems because it encourages the athlete to do things perhaps they're not ready for, which the coach can figure out for them, both physically and mentally. AI is not going to do it for you mentally. They're going to do it for you physically. So it's good to play with. I play around with it. I'd like to see what it tells me. And my son plays around with it also, and he's always telling me things he's tried out to see what AI would say. And it sometimes gives him, pretty good information. He showed me a couple of things. One of them that really caught my attention was, give me a Joe Friel training plan for 1 week based on the Bible, using language from the Bible.
Oh my
And
God.
so it came back with, workouts that involved thous and thou shalt nots and all this sort of stuff.
You may eat of all of the power bars in the cupboard.
Yeah, it was really comical, kind of fun to read, but it never crossed my mind to use the St. James or what is it,
King
the
James.
King James version of the Bible to write a training plan.
That's
And so it was
amazing. And
really kind
also
of fun
very
to
funny
read.
because you wrote the Bible. You wrote the training Bible.
That's why he did it. It was really, this is the sort of stuff you can do, which is kind of fun just to play with. So I play around with it also to see what it'll do. But I also use it to do some research for me, So I spend a lot of time when I'm writing going back to find research. So I'll tell, rather than me spend an hour and a half trying to find a research study on some minute topic, I can ask AI, and with a matter of seconds, it can have the research for me, which saves me a heck of a lot of time and effort to do it. So it's got good things about it, things I really enjoy. It's just a matter of how we're going to get along with this as we move forward with our sport and lifestyle in general.
Kind of along the same lines, like we are just awash in data and devices and analytics. And then there's this other sort of movement in coaching that's like, it should all be by feel, like ignore your power meter. Like, how do you make room for both of those realities? Like, how do you approach that puzzle of data on one side and feels on the other?
Yeah, I think it's valuable to have feels. I don't want to downplay that. I think it's very important to understand your body. I can go way back to when I first started. I started, doing all this stuff back in the 1950s and 60s, and we didn't have any wearables. We didn't even have power meters or even heart rate monitors or even stopwatches for decades. It was 1970 before I got my first stopwatch. And that was long after I was out of college. I ran in college, ran in high school, ran in junior high school. The only person who had a stopwatch was the coach. And I can recall going to track workouts, and the coach, would have us do intervals. He always had we always did the same interval over and over and over every day, 5 days a week. Ever Back in those days, you didn't train 7 days a week. You only trained 5 days a week. But he would have us do 400-meter, back in those days, it was 440 yards, actually, quarter-mile repeats. And he had the stopwatch. Nobody else knew what the times were until we came to the finish line to cross the line where he had drawn on the track, the center track with his foot. And we'd cross that line. He would tell us what our time was. He'd yell them out as we went across the line. And so I was amazed when we finally got a stopwatch on my wrist in 1970. And I could actually time myself when I was running, and then heart rate monitors came out in 1977, and then power meters in 1987, 88. And it just keeps coming out. The stuff just keeps coming out all the time. I think it's very valuable. It's good information. It's valuable information, but you've got to be able to do things based on how you feel also. If your power meter died on your bike, you forgot to plug it in to charge it, you should still be able to do the event, the workout, the race, whatever it may be. You should still be able to do it. You just need to get a sense of what it feels like in zones, let's say 1 through 10. That's all we had back in those days. I'd go for a run with my buddies, and we'd talk about how it feels. One guy would say it feels like a 6 to me, and the other guy would say it feels like an 8 to me. And it's kind of like, what's going on? Why is it not a 6 for everybody or an 8 for everybody? Why is it 6 for one and 8 for another? There's all this stuff going on in your head, trying to work your way through. It all becomes obvious after a while, but you don't think about these things until you get away from using devices.
What is something that you have believed your entire coaching career? Something that you were like, this was true when I started coaching, and I believe it's still to be true now.
The most basic thing is it's got to be fun. If you're not enjoying it, do something else. Find something else that'll keep you involved. But that's the reason why I do it, and that's the reason why I think most athletes do it, is because they enjoy it. If you get into it because you want to beat people, or you want to win a race, or you want to break 3 hours for the marathon, or go sub-9 for an Ironman, that's the only thing you got in your mind all the time, is that. I think it's kind of pointless. The first thing has got to be that you just enjoy doing it. You go for a workout because you enjoy going for a workout. You don't do this because it's something you have to do. You're doing it because you want to do it. I think that's always the starting point for all of this. And if you're not enjoying it, you really need to have this long conversation with yourself. Why do I do this? Should I continue doing it? Should I stop doing races and just work out for health and fitness? You've got to have, at the bottom line is, it's got to always be something that you enjoy. I think that's the starting point always for endurance sports.
That. And then on the flip side, what is like a belief, a strongly held belief you had at one point that eventually you were like, I don't believe that anymore.
I suppose there's a heck of a lot of things like that.
It's
I'm
the
often asked,
nature
what
of
would
getting older. It's
yeah, it
like,
is. What would I tell myself when I was 21 years old, about sport? And, I don't know. There's so many little things that I've already talked about. One, which is just getting used to how you feel when you're working out. But if I was to talk to myself now about where I am as a coach, I would tell myself not to take myself too seriously. All this stuff changes. The stuff you believe in right now may not be what we believe in 10 years from now, because I've seen that happen. So, don't take yourself too seriously. Take it all with a grain of salt. This is something you enjoy doing right now, and your way you're doing it is fine, but just be yourself and accept who you are and let sport be a part of that. Don't try to make yourself into somebody you aren't. That's the first way to destroy who you really are for the rest of your life if you try to become somebody else.
I love that. So it's sort of like your one deeply held conviction is have fun, and then your second one is like try not to get any other like aggressive convictions. It's sort of like, and that
Yeah.
what a great way to look at it.
Yeah, there's more to it. There's so much stuff. If I was to talk to myself again when I was 21 years old, I would probably tell myself sometimes the worst thing that happens to you in life works out to be the best thing. You just have to wait and see what happens because of it. I've had lots of things like that in my life that turned out to be extremely difficult as far as my life is concerned at the time, but they turned out later on to be some of the best things that ever happened to me. I'll give you an example. Somehow I got infected with a virus back in about 1995 or so that settled in my heart. The cardiologist told me don't work out until this is all gone. This will take months for it to go away. So I couldn't ride my bike, I couldn't swim, I couldn't run, I couldn't do anything at all until the pain went away, till the virus was gone. And I thought, man, this is the worst thing that ever happened to me in my entire life. And lo and behold, what happened was because of that, I'd been asked to write a book by the publisher. And I said, no, I haven't got time to write a book. I'm too busy training coaches, or actually coaching and training myself. So I haven't got time. So when I got this virus in my heart, all of a sudden I had several months in front of me with nothing to do for like 15, 16 hours a week. So I called the publisher back and said, okay, I'll write that book for you. And that book turned out to be the Cyclist Training Bible, the first book I ever wrote. And didn't think anything of it, but it was kind of like it filled the gap for 9 months for me till the difficulty went away. Turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me because I found out I enjoyed writing books, and that became basically my profession, was writing books for athletes. But it started out as the worst thing that ever happened to me. And that's not the only time it's ever happened. This has happened before to me. So you've got to look at things with a positive mind always. This may be something terrible right now, but it could wind up being something really good for you also. So just hang in there.
My next question, you might have just answered it, but it was basically if you could get a message to the entire endurance world and they would hear you, what would you say?
I would say have fun. Just enjoy it. Don't take yourself too seriously. I'm reading a book right now that I'm really enjoying. This guy talking about training for his first ultra marathon. He's a pretty good marathoner to begin with. He's 250 marathoner, probably in his late 30s, I would guess. He hasn't really said his age, but he talks about training for his. He wants to go to do UTMB, which is the pinnacle. It's the Ironman of ultra running. And he has to go through all these races. He's trying to qualify within 1 year, which is a big challenge. Usually people take 2 or more years to qualify. He's trying to do it in 1 year. And he's talking about all the races he's doing and how he gets himself through all these, K races, 100-mile races and so forth, step by step, how he gets through all these races. It's quite challenging to see what he's doing. And it's fun to read about something that I've never done ultra marathoning. I've run marathons, but I've never done an ultra. I've done ultra distance in a day, but never in a race. I've done a marathon and come home that day and run 10 miles afterwards, which is stupid. But I've never done an ultra at all. So it's kind of an eye opener for me to see how this guy is doing this. And this is interesting stuff. This is the sort of thing that keeps me interested in sport, is what other people can do also with their time in the sport.
And then last question, other than your own books, which, I will give you a chance to plug here in a second, but other than your own books, are there any books or like articles or videos or films that you find yourself recommending more than any other?
Oh man, I could go way back. One of the books that got me to thinking was a book called Serious Training, written back in 1989. Read that. I was flying to Kona for Ironman in 1989, and I just picked up this book, and so I read it on the airplane flying over there. I couldn't put it down. A really interesting book about training for endurance sports, and it got me started thinking about the details of training. I'd thought about it before, but never had I read about somebody else's way of seeing the world of training. So now I had something to compare myself to, because there really weren't before that. There really weren't too many books. There wasn't much out there on training for endurance sports. There were other books written by scientists on things they had learned about sport, about health, usually health and wellness, which is all well and good. But this guy was actually writing about training for an endurance event, and so I found that extremely interesting, and it kind of settled into my mind. And it's still a book that I go back to occasionally and take a look at, because the author just did a great job in writing it. But there were a lot of books back in those days, the 1980s, that I read that influenced my thinking. I won't go into all of them, but I probably can't even think of all of them. But his was one that really stood out for me.
All right, Serious Training. Do you remember the author's name?
Oh gosh, I thought you were going to ask me that.
We'll
This
we'll
is
uh
embarrassing.
we'll put it in the show notes. I'll go dig it up and put it in the show notes. But all right, now where can people find your books? What are the books that you've written that you're really excited about at the moment? Where can people follow you? How can people get more Joe Friel in their life?
I just wrote a book. It's going to come out in June. I wrote a book back in 2013 called Fast After 50, written for over 50 aged
Great book.
athletes. And it turned out to be quite popular. But it was getting old. So this past few months, I rewrote the book. I just threw away the entire manuscript. I kept the title and just rewrote the entire book. So that'll be out in June. It'll be an interesting book, because it is for me anyway, because it put together a lot of things I've been thinking about over the years. In fact, it's also fun for me because I've got my son's picture on the cover, Dirk. He's now in his 50s. And so when I wrote the first book, he was in his 50s. And so I didn't involve him at all in the book, but this one has got his picture on the cover as a 50-something-year-old athlete mountain biking. So I'm going to have that out, and I'm looking forward to seeing it on the shelves, because I think it's going to catch on really well with athletes.
Yeah, the original Fast After 50 is a great book, and everybody should have it.
Thank
I've
you.
got it on my coaching shelf, and really, even if you are not over 50, even if you're just simply interested in physiology and what happens to our bodies as we change and we age, really, really helpful. It's the book that made me start talking to every athlete as we're all aging athletes, regardless of how old we are. Like the process of aging is taking place, and understanding that and anticipating that, we will get to this arbitrary point. We just call it 50, um, where things change in a profound way, and there's sort of different like little places along the way. For me, it was like 36 was like the real big change, where I was like, oh my gosh, like things are different than when I was 31, and I'm creeping up on 50 right now. So it's sort of like, okay, what is that going to look like, and how does it work? But I'm very stoked to hear that there's going to be a new version of the book.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it'll be out. It should be out in June.
Awesome. Well, everybody go find Joe in all the places. I believe the website is Joe Friel author, or just Joe Friel,
Joe Friel Training.
joefrieltraining.com. Yep. So you can find him there. Are you on any of the social media places?
Oh yeah, a lot of them. Substack, uh, and uh, Blue Sky,
Oh, good.
Facebook,
Yeah.
LinkedIn. Those are the ones I'm primarily on.
Awesome. Well, I will put links to those in the show notes, everybody, so you can follow Joe and see what he's up to and buy his new book. Joe, thank you so much. This is such an honor and a privilege. And I could keep asking you questions for another hour, but we both have things to do. You've got to get back to your house renovation, and I just really appreciate it. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you for inviting me, Chris. Enjoyed it.